Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. So, today we're going to be continuing our series on the evolution of Catholic dogma. This has been a very long series. I think it's actually been because of the amount of sort of things I have going on. I don't like to release more than two series videos a week. I don't know. Maybe eventually I'll have to bump it up to three just because of the amount. I do have a bit of a backlog, actually, the amount of backlog that I have for a lot of these things. So I don't know. Just depends. Some people just like to occasionally listen to stuff like this. But anyways, today we're going to be getting into the first real episode in the third part of this series. In the third part of this series, we've already looked at, the way in which evolution works kind of from a, I guess you could say, reason perspective. And then we've looked at the way in which conclusions can be contained in premises in the theology, the faith of theology, the science of theology. We've kind of looked about that already. We've looked at the history between the various different positions. We looked at stuff like that. But now we're actually going to kind of be getting into where the rubber hits the road. So we're going to look at things like how does the church's defining power actually fit in? Because what's nice about this series, and what's nice, I think, about the way in which I go about these things, is I'm actually slowly. Sorry, there's something on my computer screen. Slowly introducing you guys to a lot of these things. I'm slowly introducing certain terms. I'm slowly introducing certain concepts. I'm slowly introducing all of this stuff. So when we actually get to, discussing it as a place, so we're discussing it as a doctrine, we're discussing it in its sort of proper area in this sort of problem that we're talking about, then you've already been introduced to kind of what the solution is in general terminology, and we're really just treating it in a technical manner. So in this section, first we're going to be dealing with the first two episodes are going to be kind of fun, which I've already went over a little bit. But the first two episodes is going to be, how do we consider the theological conclusion before the church's definition? So let's say certain I'm just going to assume the truth of Thomism here over Molinism. Let's say the truth of Thomism when it comes to the nature of sufficient grace. Let's say we would say that is a theological conclusion. We would say that we actually have what's called apodictic certainty, which means that we're drawing forth a necessary conclusion from necessary premises rather than merely probable or dialectical reasoning. So how would, let's say, sufficient grace fit in for us Thomists? What's the type of assent that we give to sufficient grace versus what's the type of assent that we give to certain other theological conclusions that have been defined as matters of faith? Let's say maybe certain things about the Eucharist, certain theological conclusions about the Eucharist that were eventually raised to the level of dogma. So how exactly do each one of these fit in for us before the church's definition and then after the church's definition? And can we look at certain individuals who lived before and fought? Some people like to say that St. Thomas fought the Immaculate Conception. I don't think that's true, and I've done a few videos on that. I'm actually doing a patron series on that right now. So if you want to support the show and you want to find out about St. Thomas's view on the Immaculate Conception, you can become a patron at patreon.com/MiltonThomas. But anyway, shameless plug. So how do we fit in with also historical figures who, before the definition of certain theological conclusions, were actually erroneous about these positions? Were they sinning against the faith because we're held to these on faith? Were they merely sinning against somehow the virtue of theology? So how do we think about all of these things? And this is going to be very helpful to clear this up when we're thinking through the proper categories. Okay, so now I'm getting to my notes. So we need to kind of at the outset make two distinctions, and one of those I'm actually going to kind of lay a surprise down for you once we kind of get to it. But for now, kind of think in these terms, and we're going to see that this distinction isn't what it seems. But the first distinction we can make between what's called a a material conclusion, or better yet, a conclusion materially considered, and a formal conclusion, or a conclusion formally considered. This can also be like the first one can be called the only reason I call it material, which was one of the terms which can be used to describe it, is because uh, I can't specific. Let's just keep specific. It's another form of species. I can't pronounce it properly, so I'm just gonna say material. Material. That's fine. You guys are probably never gonna read about this in anybody else in your entire lives. So, just material for now. So, what a conclusion materially considered, or material conclusion, is considering the conclusion as contained in the premise. So, considering the conclusion as contained in the premise, versus the conclusion formally considered, or formal conclusion, is considering the conclusion as deduced from the premise. So, considering it under the aspect or ratio of being deduced. So, what some theologians, such as Vasquez or Lugo as well, what they're going to say is that when one comes to a theological conclusion, they considering it as a considering the formal aspect of this, or basically the conclusion as deduced from the premises, when we consider it under that aspect, that's not the cause of our assent. They would say that that's merely what's called a condition of our assent. And the condition differs from a cause in that the condition doesn't have a positive influx, but merely, you could say, removes an impediment to it, or somehow applies it. That would be better yet. So it doesn't positively cause it, merely applies a cause. So they would say, okay, the conclusion formally considered, so the conclusion as deduced, that's merely a condition rather than a cause of our assent. So the conclusion materially considered, so the conclusion as contained in the premises, that's actually the cause of our assent. And therefore, theological conclusion considered in this way can fall under the virtue of faith. So that's the reasoning that they bring, and they would use the analogous example. We can look at a few examples of a condition. One would be like the motives of credibility, if you know what that is. The motives of credibility are conditions rather than causes of our assent of faith. Or you can think about the church's relationship to the preaching of dogma. The church isn't a sort of cause of revelation. The church is merely a condition for applying revelation. So they would say, okay, our reasoning process is merely a condition of us discovering matters to assent with the assent of faith. So the second distinction we need to make is the distinction between a theological conclusion. I already went over this. Sorry, my introductions tend to be not scripted at all. I don't have any. I just talk about whatever I feel like in the introduction. So the second distinction we need to make is the distinction between a theological conclusion before the definition of the church, theological conclusion after the definition of the church. So before the definition of the church, we see that the conclusion is known through a certain medium. And what is this medium? This medium is the medium of reasoning. So we have these premises that we know. Let's take the example, and I'll keep up this example throughout this episode. But the premise that, let's say, the soul is spiritual. Let's say we didn't hear anything in Scripture about the immortality of the soul. We just heard the soul is spiritual. Well, we know from reason, from the medium of reasoning, we know that we can conclude from this to the fact that the soul is immortal, and it's known through this medium of reasoning. Now, after the definition of the church, we know it through not one medium, but we know through two mediums. We know it through reasoning on the one hand, because after the definition of the church, you kind of just don't lose your reasoning. You still know through that mode. On the other hand, now you also know it through a different means, and that's the means of faith. Now we know it through the means of faith. So what this section is meant to treat is we're meant to treat the issue of before the definition. So the issue of how do the habits that we have in our soul, how do they relate to a theological conclusion? Is it the habit of faith? Is the habit of theology? Is the habit of reason? And I'll kind of explain a little bit later what those things are. But broadly speaking, for the Thomist, theological conclusions are never a matter of faith before the definition of the church. Never. It's not a matter of faith, they would say, because it's already and only a matter of reasoning. Because that's the medium whereby we know, is we know by reasoning, therefore it's not a matter of faith, because faith is not motivated by reasoning, it is motivated by God revealing. So for the Thomists, we kind of think that the distinction, and I'll explain it a little bit later, but we kind of think the distinction above between the conclusion materially and the conclusion formally considered, we kind of think it's bunk. We don't think it makes sense. Because basically the manner of reasoning is not merely a condition, it's actually the medium of knowing, which is what specifies habits, which, again, I'll explain in more detail a little bit later. So in order to understand, okay, why do we think that we can assent to faith? I mean, there's others who think that we can. I mean, for example, the Scotists think so. The Nominalists think so. Suarez himself will get how he actually secretly thinks so. This may not be apparent from what I've said, but he does. Lugo does. Vasquez does. Basically a lot of the scholastics, besides the Dominican school, a lot of them actually are going to, say, hey, before definition, we can actually, due to the kind of, I'm kind of caricaturing it for sake of illustration, but due to the bigness of our brain, it's different because conclusion formally materially considered, blah, blah, blah. Basically, due to the bigness of our brain, we're able to come to a theological conclusion with such certainty that actually we can know that it's in the deposit of faith, based on God's witness, and therefore, we can assent to it with the assent of faith. So why are they wrong? And why are actually we right about this? And as a brief comment before we can continue, this is actually something that is completely agreed upon by the Thomists and by the Thomists, both of the modern strain and also the Thomists of the Solian strain. So we already all agree about. So as a brief note, this is something that is actually agreed upon by both modern Thomists, so-called. Something that is important to note is that we've kind of already brought up the difference between, the post-Sum Monticenses, a lot of the post-Sum Monticenses Thomists, which end up getting, represented by a lot of the contemporary Thomists in Marine Sola's day. The difference between them and Marine Sola, who is claiming fidelity to an earlier tradition and to St. Thomas himself. So what we have to do is we have to realize at this point that before the definition of the church, these two schools completely agree when it comes to this matter. It's really the question has to do with, okay, what do we do after the definition of the church? So at this point, those who follow Garrigou and Scholte, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the French name, Scholte or Schultz, if you want to anglicize it. Those who follow those individuals and most modern Thomists are going to agree with what I have to say here. So this shouldn't be too controversial. So in order to understand why what I just said, as the brief overview of the Thomistic position, why that makes sense, we have to understand what St. Thomas teaches about habits, and particularly what specifies habits. What by specifies, I mean places it in its species. So what makes, knowledge different than faith? And what makes one kind of knowledge by one kind of reasoning, let's say metaphysical reasoning, different from knowledge by mathematical reasoning, or knowledge by physical reasoning, or knowledge by, let's say, I don't know, induction? What specifies these different types of knowledge? This is going to be important because, if you didn't know, theological reasoning and faith, these are a type of intellectual habits. So faith is one type of intellectual habit. Theology is a different type of intellectual habit. So when it comes to passing between habits, how does this happen? Because there's a certain claim by some theologians, which we're denying, that there can be this passing of habit. Something can go from a theological conclusion before the church's definition to, an assent of faith before the church's definition. So how exactly are we to think of this as good Thomists? So we have to, and to kind of, I guess, bring this into a sort of sharp relief, we can consider examples when there are a multitude of different habits that actually are directed towards the same object. So I'll give an example. So when thinking about, let's say the immortality of the soul, that's a good example. So you may have somebody who believes in the immortality of the soul because they deduced it from reason. Or we may have a person, let's say, even going further back. We have somebody who assents to the immortality of the human soul because somebody told them that. Their teacher told them that. They don't know why, the teacher told them that. And so they believe it. So this is the habit of human faith. So let's say that same person then not only has human faith, but adds on a different habit. Let's say he studies the issue and is able to reason to it. So now not only does he have faith, but he actually has now science in the proper sense. So now we have two. We have two different habits, same object. Now let's say that individual goes and becomes a Christian and then assents to the same thing now by faith because he sees it in Revelation and in the teaching of the church. So now he assents to the same object by human faith, by reason, discursive reasoning, by divine faith. And let's say also he goes into different parts of divine revelation and finds these contained in principle. So now he also treats it as a theological conclusion, which he deduces from other principles. So there's four habits with one object. So what actually makes all of these different? What makes all of these different habits that can be of the same object? What makes them different? So before we even begin, what we need to do is we need to be very clear again about four presuppositions that we have about theological reasoning, which is going to help us. So first, every theological conclusion begins with a major premise of divine faith. So major premise, remember, first premise in a syllogism. Second, the minor premise is metaphysically inclusive, not merely physically connexive. So we have sort of a unity of object with the major and the minor premise, but different concepts of that object. Third, the middle term is a revealed term. That the middle term connects the major and minor premise. And then fourth, therefore, as I kind of already said, the premise and conclusions contain a real identity. So all four of these are going to be very important. So in order to understand what's going on with what I just said, is we have to make a distinction between what's known as the material object and what's known as the formal object. So the material object refers to the thing. So right there with those four different habits that I brought up that same individual may have, or we may even say something like, we have a Muslim. Let's pretend the Muslim does not have an extraordinary grace of any sort. We have a Muslim who believes in the existence of God. And we have, let's say, a Christian who believes in the existence of God. The Christian not only believes in the existence of God, maybe by reason, who's reasoned to it, or does by reason, rather, but also believes in the same doctrine, the same thing, the same material object, the same thing under a different light. And that's by divine faith. But the Muslim only has it under one light. So this distinction, which we brought up, is we have the material object, which is the thing known. The thing known. On the other hand, kind of I hinted at it by the way in which I described it over and over again. We not only have the thing known. Sorry, my computer's dying. Charge. Sorry. So not only do we have the thing known, so that's the first thing that determines the material object, But we also have the medium of knowing, the medium of knowing. And this medium of knowing ends up being the formal object. So when it comes to the Muslim, his medium of knowing is by the process of a sort of deductive process of reasoning. With the Christian, their medium of knowing is something which is completely different. They know not by a sort of not only by a deductive process, but they also know by the light of divine revelation. So the medium of knowing is the formal object in any habit. So we think back to our first example I gave with the soul. We have the same formal object, knowing that the soul is immortal, but we have the difference between human faith. That's the first medium of knowing. Second is process of reasoning, which is the second medium of knowing. Third is the process of theological reasoning, which is interesting because we can have different processes of reasoning, which are different mediums of knowing, namely physical, mathematical, metaphysical, and theological. And then lastly, we have divine faith as well, which is different means of knowing. Which we have human faith as well. So it's actually. We have all of these different mediums of knowing from different degrees of light, different reasoning processes, and blah, 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 blah. So we may have the same material object, the same thing known, but under different lights. This is very important because this kind of, as you can see, is going to offer us the key to solving our problem. It's going to offer the key to understanding the Thomistic solution. Because when we're going through theological reasoning, the medium of knowing is going to be, what is it? Theological reasoning. But when we have an object of faith, that is something which is formally revealed and proposed as such by the church, we have a certain medium of knowing. That's the medium of knowing via divine faith. So this is going to right there implicitly contain the Thomistic solution. Because as I've said before, and this is a sort of interesting thing. As I've said before, the material object, there's a real identity. So this was kind of the fourth proposition in what I briefly overviewed above when it comes to theological conclusions. It's the same material object. So that's actually very important, that it's the same material object all the way through, which is going to help us in the next episode when we begin to talk about how the church can define a thing of faith. So now I wanted to briefly go in and focus on the medium of understanding or the medium of knowing, particularly of theological truth, because this is going to be very helpful to specifically look at the medium of knowing of theological truth. So in order to understand the problem, what I wanted to do is I wanted to go into a little bit of a thought experiment. So we've already shown, I think, one of the lessons of the last part, but we already showed that there's basically two ways of knowing a revealed truth. One is by the revealed datum, so it's revealed to us formally speaking, and the second is by way of a sort of deduction from the revealed datum. So in the first way is going to also conclude, the revealed datum and that which is clarified from the revealed datum. So basically, a particular and a universal, or maybe a sort of nominal to a real definition, or basically a thing to its essential notes, things like this. That's merely going to be clarifying what is already formally there. So that's the first way, by way of the revealed datum. Second, by way of a real deduction from the revealed datum, which is going to be the materially identical theological conclusion we've already talked about. And then the third way is basically by both, because we said we can have multiple habits of the same object. So now let's make a different supposition. And this supposition is, in the first case, that the whole of Revelation is one proposition, and the proposition is the soul is immortal, Or let's say the soul never dies. If it was something like this, it would basically be the part of that equivalency that I just mentioned. Something like the soul is immortal or the soul never dies. So formally revealed. In the second case, let's pretend that the entirety of Revelation was one verse. It was, the book of John was just one verse, and there was no other books in the Bible. And all it said was John 1:1, the soul is spiritual, and it said nothing else. And then the third supposition, we could also pretend that both are there. So the soul is spiritual. We can conclude from that the soul is immortal. So in the second case, we have a sort of virtual revelation. So in the first case, the soul is immortal. And then we see that the soul is immortal and then believe because God has revealed it, that it is true. We have the assent of divine faith. This is obvious. Nobody disagrees on this. And the medium of understanding this is an immediate understanding on the basis of divine authority, or as I said, in any sort of equivalent case, which is deducted by what's called improper elation or an explanatory syllogism is what it's deduced by. And in the second and third instance, what we do is we go look, we find a certain premise, and then we have something that we know from human reason. And then through this, by a process of deduction, we come to a conclusion. So this, the medium of knowing, unlike the first case, where all of Revelation is that the soul is immortal, and the second, where the soul is spiritual, the medium whereby we know that the soul is immortal through the soul is spiritual is we know via some sort of process of human reasoning. So it's a different habit. Simple understanding and human reasoning, different habits. So we're going to see that this is not something which is an assent of faith. So something, again, which is very important is that in the second case, the conclusion is materially identical, but it's something which is formally distinct. So same object, different medium of cognition. Which is kind of cool. It all kind of lines up, as you see. So I actually saw a very cool illustration of this, so I wanted to illustrate it in this way. So let's pretend in the syllogism, basically the soul is spiritual, that which is spiritual is immortal, therefore the soul is immortal. Let's put the mediums of cognition in there to kind of highlight this a little bit more. So the major premise, which we all always know, what is a major premise? Major premise is the truth of divine faith. Okay, good. Thank you. So the major premise is God says that the soul is spiritual. God says that, that's the parentheses, the soul is spiritual. So the medium of cognition, this is something which is a divine faith. God says that the soul is spiritual. And the minor, what is the minor? Minor is that which is spiritual is immortal. How do we know that which is spiritual is immortal? It's I see that which is spiritual is immortal. So I see that it's something. So it's by some sort of process of reasoning or some sort of first principle that we see by a light of reason or whatever. So this is some sort of human knowledge. And then in the conclusion, how do we state the medium of cognition that the soul is immortal? We would say that I see that in what God says that the soul is immortal. So I see that in what God says. So this is the habit of theology right here, is you seeing something in what God says. So you're seeing something in what God says. So this is going to be a different habit than mere reason, but it's something which is because it's rooted in what God says, and the object is somehow theological because it's about what God says, but it's still going to be something different than the assent of faith because it's you seeing something. It's not God saying that. If we said, for example, God says in what God says in what God says, then that would be an assent of divine faith because it's on the motive of God revealing. But this motive is that you're seeing something. So that's very important. So from this, we can see that theology is a science. But, and kind of this is the curveball from earlier, what I said, not all theologians agree when it comes to this. There are many theologians who disagree. And from what all I said, we're going to be able to see that what they say is actually just wrong from all the principles that I just laid out. So if you remember the distinction that I gave you in the beginning that I said was going to kind of throw us for a curveball, that was the distinction between the conclusion as conclusion and the conclusion as in the premise. So in order to preserve the doctrine that something can be considered divine faith before the definition of the church, what have they done here? What have they done here? They've made two assents. So an assent to the conclusion is conclusion, which is going to be the assent of uh, theology. And then on the other hand, they made the assent to the conclusion as in the premise, which they say is the assent of divine faith. So they have right here two assents. How many mediums of knowing do they have? One. So basically, they're going to have to mess with a clear and evident truth about the medium of knowing, about the specification of habits. So we say something is specified by its medium of knowing, specified by its medium of knowing, over and over and over again. It's very clear to remember. But what they're going to do is they're going to have one medium of knowing. So they know something by one medium, that is by theological reasoning, but they have two assents that come from this one medium of knowing, which is something which is absurd. Have two assents, one medium. So why do they do that? And really, of course, there's the Scotists on the one hand, which they hold to what's called an intrinsic specification of habits. So they simply, come up with a whole different theory of how habits are specified. But the reason that Suarez does this, and the reason that most modern theologians do this, so unless you're talking to a Scotist, it's not going to be too important of information. But the reason they do it is because Suarez held to the physico-connexive as the true theological conclusion. And this influences a lot of the Jesuits. So since they hold to the physico-connexive as the true theological conclusion, they haven't really covered that much in detail. Well, what did he think about the metaphysico-virtual? What did he think about what we would say is a theological conclusion? Did he just kind of get rid of it? No, we actually didn't. He calls this the formal confused, which we kind of have a similar statement of the formal implicit, which we would say is just, defining terms, basically clarifying in that way the first degree of evolution that we mentioned earlier. But he has the metaphysico-virtual, which he would say, okay, it's a truth. It's something which is through the medium of theology, basically. So he would say that through the medium of theology, that you have something which can be concluded if it's metaphysico-virtual, and he holds the Scotist position on this. It's like really weird. He kind of he's holding between the Thomist position, which he messes up, and the Scotist position, which kind of also messes up. Sorry, Suarez. He messes up both of them. So on the one hand, he agrees with the Scotists and say, well, there are theological conclusions from the formal confused that are actual theological conclusions, and that we can assent to the assent of faith. So he holds that on the one hand, when this is with the metaphysico-virtual. And on the other hand, with the physico-connexive, he holds that there are things outside of the deposit of faith which can be defined as faith. But he actually holds a sort of objective difference when it comes to this. So this is why Suarez actually had to come up with basically the same solution when it came to the metaphysico-virtual, which is that you have conclusion as conclusion, and then conclusion is contained in the premises. And then on the other hand, he also held to a sort of continuing revelation when it came to the physico-connexive. So in order to understand Suarez, you have to understand that one as that kind of weird thing as well. Okay, well, that's all when it comes to this. Next week, we'll be going over, or next time, I guess, we'll be going over the conclusion after the definition of the church.